Good afternoon, everyone. I think we still have a few folks trickling in, but I think we can get started. I'm Rosita Vivanco. I'm the Chief Strategy and Engagement Officer at Tech Equity. So we're here today with a wonderful group of panelists to talk about how AI is fueling hiring and firing decisions. I'm so excited to have you join us for this fourth installment of our AI and Equity Education Series. So our goal with this series is to make sure that folks in the legislature, our partners, everyone on this Zoom call today feel equipped to talk about these issues at a deeper level and have access to a network of advocates and subject matter experts across a bunch of different areas impacted by AI. Tech Equity's mission is to raise public consciousness about economic equity issues that result from tech, with a focus on the intersection of tech and housing and labor. Our work is really centered on three things: education and research, contributing to policy and regulation, and ensuring we don't just bring policy ideas to the table, but that we ensure that they are successful, implemented, and enforced. A couple quick things, housekeeping things before we jump in. We enforce a code of conduct. So basically that's saying we want to create a safe space for learning and be respectful to one another. We'll have time at the end for discussion. So feel free to drop anything you'd like to ask our panelists in the Q&A featured at the bottom of your screen. And finally, this event is being recorded. We are posting recaps of this event and all of the past AI and equity events on our site. And then in addition to this event, Tech Equity earlier this year launched AI policy principles, which outline recommendations for responsible AI development and deployment. So these principles, quickly going through them: one, people most impacted by AI need to have agency to shape how that tech impacts them. Two, we have responsibility to shift the burden of proof to companies to make sure their tech isn't creating harm and make sure regulators and individuals have what they need to hold them accountable. And three, we can't really effectively make sure tech is safe and beneficial to everyone if you don't deal with the concentration of power and information that exists that's very hard to effectively regulate today. We're in the process of mapping out future events in the series. So if you're interested in continuing to get information about upcoming events, relevant news in AI and policy and equity space, make sure to sign up on our event series page, which you can get from this QR code. We can also drop the link in the chat. So with that, I can stop talking and pass it over to our moderator, Mariko Yoshihara, who's going to lead today's conversation.
Great. Thank you, Rosita. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this panel. My name is Mariko Yoshihara. I'm an advocate here in Sacramento. And again, we have really an all-star panel today. So let me first just introduce our panelists. We have Matt Scherer, who is a senior policy counsel for workers' rights and technology at the Center for Democracy and Technology, CDT. Matt analyzes workplace technology issues and advocates for policymakers and private organizations to adopt policies that protect workers' digital rights and ensure that new technologies enhance justice and equality. Nancy Tippins is a principal of the Nancy T. Tippins Group, LLC, where she assists clients in employee selection. She has participated in the development of professional standards for tests and assessments, including the principles for the development and validation of personnel selection procedures, the standards for educational and psychological testing, and ISO standards for assessments. And lastly, Hilka Elman. She is an Emmy Award-winning investigative reporter and assistant professor of journalism at New York University. In her book, The Algorithm: How AI Decides Who Gets Hired, Monitored, Promoted, and Fired, and Why We Need to Fight Back, she investigates the rise of AI in the world of work. I highly suggest you read this book. It's really great. So let's get started. Lots to talk about. Hilka, I'm hoping that you can really set the stage around what we're here talking about today. What are these tools? How do they work? I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah. And let me just jump in and say, like, thank you for having us all. Thank you for for listening. I think there is sort of often a generational divide that like all my students at NYU know all of these companies and know one-way video interviews, and lots of folks who may be older or maybe have like a lot of work experience have never heard of them. But let me tell you something, what kind of tools we find in the hiring space, and also I want to share a little bit like sort of how often we see these kinds of tools. So, and I wanted to share why companies may use AI tools. So what I found out is that, since sort of the dawn of job platforms like LinkedIn and Indeed and others, companies have gotten inundated with applications. So when I talk to Google, they get about 3 million applications a year. IBM gets about 5 million applications a year. So HR folks and hiring managers, they just complain like we are drowning in applications. We get 10,000 applications for a job. We need a technological solution. So let me walk you through the solution, and it's in every category, right? Goldman Sachs last year said that they got over 220,000 applications for their summer internships alone.
Wow.
That's a lot of applications to go through. So what we see in this, and if you want to share the hiring funnel slide, you sort of see like in the HR folks call this a funnel where you start finding people when you are screening them, where recruiters might reach out to people, and then there's a screening phase so there's sourcing where recruiters reach out to folks and put up a job description, and then in the screening phase, it's often when folks send their application in through Indeed, LinkedIn, and all the other job platforms. And I talked to most of them, ZipRecruiter and others, and they all use some form of AI. We know very little what kind of AI they use, how they use it. It was sort of voluntary from CEOs at these companies or high-ranking officers that I spoke to that I learned about this. And then we also know that almost all Fortune 500 companies use some form of AI in their hiring funnel. And we see these tools often used in, it started out sort of in hourly work for fast food, retail. We see a lot of, because, there's a continuous need to hire people. Like I think Walmart does about 10,000 interviews or so a day because, they have to continuously staff Walmart stores. But we also see this, I've seen it for teachers at Atlanta Public Schools. We've seen it for flight attendants. Delta Airlines used AI one-way video interviews at one point. So we see it at every stage and in a lot of different businesses. And we see it also a lot for recent college graduates, because a lot of companies say like, oh, they have great degrees, but it gets inundated with applications and they don't have a ton of work history. So let's use some AI tool. So in the screening phase, we see resume scrapers. And let me just talk about how that works and what I found out about them. So if you want to move the slide and then I'll talk about interviewing and the other stuff, to the bias keywords. So the way resume screeners usually work is you have a job description and you have a resume, and an AI tool can sort of understand like, okay, what's the overlap here? How many words of the job description do people use in the resume? And then there's another way that folks use it in companies, and often what they do is they take resumes from successful employees, which is often, or people who made it to the last round of hiring, which is seen as a sign of success. And they take these resumes, I don't know, from their accountants, 1,000 accountants, and feed all of these resumes into the AI tool, and sort of task the AI tool with finding out what do all these folks have in common. And then the new resumes from job seekers get compared to that. So if you advance the slide to the bias keywords, I think it's probably after that. Yes, there we go. So when I talk to employment lawyers, which, Matthew Scherer was formerly one, but, I've talked to others too. And, they come in when vendors and companies sort of often negotiate, especially big companies, maybe they want to use a tool or not. And some of the companies do due diligence and bring in outside counsel and, sort of employment lawyer adjacent folks. So what I found out from employment lawyers was that one of the tools used first names as predictors of success, kind of names like Thomas and Elsie. And so the hypothesis is that in this pile of resumes, there may have been a few Thomases. And so an AI tool will look for statistical relevance and may have found that there is a bunch of Thomases in the pile. It rose to be statistically relevant, so it became a predictor of success. Not something we really want to do in hiring, right? We want to look for capabilities, skills that folks have, not necessarily their first names, or we can pretty much clearly say we don't want to use that. And then we have locations like Canada and Syria. That could be the discrimination based on national origin. So those were predictors of success. Another one was possible race-based discrimination. One tool used the words Africa and African American. And another tool may have been based on gender-based discrimination. So it gave folks who had the word baseball on their resume more points, and folks who had the word softball on their resume fewer points. So if you had the word baseball, you got more points, softball, fewer points. So the hypothesis is probably, if you have historical bias in your company, which, a lot of humans produce in the hiring process. So maybe you've hired more men than women, or, this was a tech company maybe where you have sort of historically in most of them, gender disparity. So maybe there were more men in the pile that traditionally like baseball more than softball, which, more women traditionally play. So, the tool does this statistical analysis, and this problem arises. So we see this again and again. And the employment lawyers that I talked to, some said they found a problem in all of the tools that they looked at. Others said they found it in about a quarter of the tools. So, but we see it again and again. It's not just like a one-off. This happens often. And then I wanted to, another problem that folks found in these resume screeners is that, for example, in a survey of HR executive, almost 50% said who use AI tools that they know that that folks who have a longer than 6 month unemployment on their resume, they get rejected outright. So you could be the most qualified person if you took a longer than 6 month leave to care for your child or parents or whatever, or moved. You would be rejected outright by these tools. And we also know that companies, HR managers, almost 90% in those surveys said that they know that these tools reject qualified candidates, but the efficiency is so large. And, we know that these tools produce bias. There isn't a whole lot of evidence that they pick the most qualified candidates, but companies just need to use it because of the efficiency, or so they say. So we don't really have long-term studies if these tools work. I can't answer that. We don't know when companies abandon a tool because it didn't work or it created bias. We only know that because maybe they tell me or some other journalists. So, you already see that the impact of these tools could be bias and discrimination. And sometimes it could also be randomness. So I just wanted to share a quick video I did for the Wall Street Journal looking at one-way video interviews. I think you probably have to stop sharing so I can share. Yeah, looking at one-way video interviews, which are also very ubiquitous. So HireVue, one of the largest companies in this space, they put out a press release in November 2022 and said that they did their 30 millionth one-way video interview. So there's no other person on the other side. Folks get a pre-recorded questions on their phone or on their desktop, and they record themselves. They're sort of doing their own presentation. So I just wanted to share a super quick 2-minute video that you understand how this technology works and what kind of companies do in this space. So I'm going to just quickly share that. And this is my colleague, Jason Bellini, who went with me to Salt Lake City to talk to the company.
We begin our exploration of the new world of hiring with a visit to the headquarters of one of the companies that's pushing the envelope, HireVue. Its artificial intelligence assessment tool is used by over 50 companies, including Unilever and Hilton, which both declined to comment. This, I'm told, is a typical digital interview for someone applying to become a customer service rep. It confronts me with several scenarios that, on the job, I might encounter.
If you can't help me resolve this right now, I'm going to take my business elsewhere.
I'm here to try to make things better.
I go into this knowing something that HireVue acknowledges many job candidates potentially do not. That my responses are being assessed not by human beings, but by AI, analyzing my tone of voice, the clusters of words I use, and my micro expressions.
So here's what's wild to me. The notion of micro expressions, is that what you're calling them?
It's the facial analysis software. It's capturing, if you think of facial movement, smiling, frowning, eyebrow movement, those are actual database points, and they roll together to give certain emotions and traits and personality and thinking style things.
Here I am.
Yeah.
I just did the interview for a job as a customer support representative. How'd I do?
The first thing is we look at the AI score that's attached to it, and you can see that up here, you scored it at 37%.
That's pretty good, right?
No, that's out of 100, right? So you're kind of in the bottom third, if you will, in that job, so you'd be a low match, essentially.
My rating is the result of HireView's AI comparing my responses to those of actual employees. Essentially, my performance is being compared. My voice, my words, my facial expressions against a company's highest performers.
So you think?
So I'll stop it there, but I wanted to say to that, when I did this investigation in 2018, I talked to a psychologist because I was like, wow, this is this is really game changing. We do facial expression analysis to find out if we're going to be good at work or the intonation of my voice. And when I talked to the psychologist, they said wait, there is no science. There's no science what facial expressions we should have in a job interview that can infer if we're going to be successful at the job. There's also no science really what facial expression we should have on the job to infer if we're going to be successful. There's also no science around intonation of our voices. And the idea, it's called effective computing, that this technology does of reading our facial expressions. It can absolutely read that I'm smiling, but it infers that I'm happy. And that's, the idea is that humans have all these 6 basic emotions, and that's also disproven. Yes, there's a very high likelihood that when I'm smiling, I'm happy, but I've also been in job interviews and I've smiled and I wasn't happy at all. So we can't draw these conclusions from there, but companies do this all the time. And I think what happens a lot is we have the signals that we can count. We have these kinds of tools. So we're trying to find a use case, and hiring is one of them. And we don't really think about this. Is there a whole lot of science there? So the good news is, I did this investigation, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post had an investigation, and HireView actually did say they're phasing out this technology. Unfortunately, other companies are still using it. And if you want to show that quickly, the slide of the German journalist who did change the backgrounds in video interviews, and it turns out you got different results from that. So this kind of stuff is still out there, and it's sort of a little bit, I call this, so this is the one of the stills of the investigation. They had the same person saying the same thing, just change out the background, and you got different results. So the problem is they call this sometimes a little bit of a whack-a-mole. Your one company, and HireView is really the largest, and we're very grateful that they phased this out. But then there's 2 other companies who are still using it, even though we have publicly debunked this. And lastly, I just wanted to share really quickly video games that we also see employers ask folks to play. And we see this a lot in investment banking and banking and in New York, because HR folks have told me, we get millions of applications. All of these folks who just graduated with a BA or a master's degree, they kind of all look alike, and I don't know who they are. We want to look under the hood. And this is what sort of companies promise in this space, is that these tools, these video games, I'm going to show you one that I played, promise that they can do. So you see me reading here the instructions that you get when you play this. And in this case, you have to choose a hard task or an easy task. And you see, I'll start choosing. And the idea is that, the tool can find out who I am. There's another game. Here's when you have to use a hard task. When you choose the hard task, you have to hit the space bar as fast as possible. And while I was doing this game, I was thinking, what does that have to do with the job? Why do I have to hit the space bar as fast as possible? I also played this game with somebody who has who's quadriplegic, Henry Claypool, who got really worried here and with other games that what if somebody has a motor disability, can they play this game as adequately as somebody who is not disabled? And if they couldn't, would they maybe get rejected? And he had a lot of questions. And I think the disability angle is really problematic in these tools. And, there were some other questions, right? Like maybe I'm, one other game, the balloon game checks if you are how much of a risk taker you are. So you have to pump up balloons. And I was thinking, maybe I'm a total risk taker, a maverick in, pumping up balloons in a video game, but am I really a risk taker in real life? And the way these tools are calibrated is that people who are currently in the role, whatever, 50 accountants or whatever folks have, play the game. Whatever, if they're all risk takers, then job seekers will be compared to that who play the video game. So if I'm a risk taker, simplified, I might be on the yes pile. If I'm not a risk taker, I might be on the no pile. The problem is here too, is like, it seems that if my 50 accountants are all risk takers, then, it might be good to look for also risk takers in risk taking and job seekers. But the question really is like, does risk taking actually have anything to do with the job? Maybe it just happened that all your accountants, I don't know, they're all snowboarding and they're all risk takers, who knows, but it has nothing to do with the job. So that's another risk, like there's bias, discrimination, but also that we just use something that has nothing to do with the job as criteria to hire people, which I think feels almost like discrimination for folks who are actually most qualified. And then, the impact on folks with disability. And I think also, sort of we hear from people again and again that they have to send hundreds of resumes, and sort of the depression and the anxiety around this. Like, I think there might be actually people dropping out of the labor force because it's just so hard to get through all these AI screens.
Wow.
There was a long introduction to all of this.
No, it's so fascinating and alarming at the same time, but I do think it's really important for folks to fully understand what these tools look like and the impact that they have. Nancy, I'm gonna turn over to you, because having this type of testing for applicants, job applicants, is nothing new. We have decades of old guidelines and laws dealing with employment procedures and testing. So can you give us a sense of like the existing infrastructure that exists now that we are having to use as the law develops in order to address some of these new and evolving AI tools?
Sure. There are a number of professional guidelines and sets of standards that apply to employment tests in the United States, as well as in most international situations. The primary professional standards are the principles for the validation and use of personnel selection procedures that was developed by the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, or SIOP is the abbreviation for that. The other guideline is the standards for educational and psychological testing. That was developed by the American Psychological Association, the American Educational Research Association, and NCME, which is the National Council on Measurement in Education. And both of these documents explain what makes for a good test. What do you have to do in order to demonstrate that your test is an effective tool? The principles, as opposed to the standards, focus only on employment standards. And there's been a great deal of work. SIOP is very concerned. I am an industrial and organizational psychologist, and I am a member of SIOP. And we've had a task force for the last several years that has worked on how do the principles apply to AI-based assessments. After doing a lot of work, we've come to the conclusion that the existing standards for tests apply to all kinds of selection procedures, including AI-based assessments. That's not an exception. We don't give a pass on validity or the reliability of a test just because it's AI-based. Every test needs to have demonstrated validity, reliability, fairness, and it all needs to be documented. I will add that in addition to the professional standards, there are the Uniform Guidelines for Employee Selection Procedures that was written in 1978. They are very detailed, and again, they reflect common practice for employment tests in the United States.
So can you, I mean, I'm going to jump ahead to a question. I'm curious
Yes.
how you feel the existing framework, how it's able to kind of address these unique challenges of these AI tools. You know, how are employers dealing with, you know, the framework that this kind of old framework that was developed, you know, pre these AI tools?
Yeah. Well, I think there are two kinds of employers in this world, those that are attempting to comply with the existing standards and those that are just either unaware that there are standards that exist or simply don't care, or perhaps are being misled by the vendors who produce these. There are employers who are very concerned about the validity of this test because they understand the EEO laws in this country and know that they are obligated to use tests that are job relevant and consistent with business necessity if there is adverse impact against one of the protected groups. Those people do attempt to do validity studies. Typically, what they are doing is taking the test score that is generated by one of these AI-based assessments that Hilke just described and validating it in traditional methods. They have a criterion measure that's typically some form of job performance, and they are statistically relating those two things, predictor and criterion. That said, there are plenty of people who are unaware that they even need to do this, and even some very sophisticated employers are skipping this effort to validate a test and demonstrate job relevancy when the assessment is used for screening. Somehow they believe that because you're scraping social media looking for candidates, that is not an employment decision. I disagree with that. I think that is an employment decision. And even when you're in the early stages of screening, you are obligated to demonstrate that your test is an effective one.
I feel like that bears repeating because I agree, you know, in California, there's been a lot of conversation around these AI hiring tools. And, you know, I think there hasn't been much of a discussion around like what the existing obligations are. Obviously, we know we have the anti-discrimination laws, but this idea that you already have these rigorous testing protocols that you have to go through before using these tests, I think is really important, that we need to keep spreading that to not just the deployers, the employers that are using it. But I mean, I guess that's kind of the second question is, who is it, the employer that's supposed to be doing the testing? I feel like I've seen some of these AI tools where they say this is pre-tested. We've pre-tested to make sure that there's no bias and this is valid. I'm curious how you see the responsibility between the developer and the employer.
Well, I believe that it is the employer's responsibility to demonstrate that its test, the test that it's using for employment, is related to its job and is predictive of performance in its context, and that what an AI-based assessment or one of these asynchronous video interviews that Hilke just showed, they may work great if you're trying to select a person in customer service, but if you're trying to select a person who works on the assembly line, it doesn't work so well.
Right,
so the vendor has a very difficult time saying, I think my test works well for every job in every company in the entire world. That's a hard sell. So the employer has to do that. Now, the vendor can do it for the employer, but in a lot of cases, there is some concern about conflict of interest. And so there needs to be an independent review of these selection procedures that is not swayed by what the vendor needs to do in order to have that contract be signed and maintained.
Yeah.
Just if I
Yeah.
could, so before I came into my current role at CDT, I was on the other side. I was a management side employment lawyer, as Hilka kind of briefly alluded to. And one thing that I advise companies that were looking to adopt AI-based assessments or any form of assessment is that the first step that you need to do is identify, well, what are the essential knowledge, skills, and abilities for this job? And then how do you measure for them? And a big part of the concern that I have about the trends in the use of AI-based tools is that employers are not going through that first step. And they are simply kind of enticed in to this trend of vendors who are very aggressively pushing automated assessments and saying, we can measure things and our tools have been used by X, Y, and Z companies. And they don't go through that initial step of just thinking, okay, what are the essential functions of the job? What are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you need in order to successfully perform those functions? And how do we measure those? And often what ends up happening as a result is that you have a lot of companies that are testing very abstract and generic characteristics without really thinking through how they translate to the specific kind of job, much less how that specific job is performed with the specific company. And, Nancy, correct me if I'm wrong, the essence of validity is really supposed to be ideally specific to the job at that company. Because even if, for example, you are testing for how well, let's say you're an attorney, like an attorney's job, if you are at a small law firm in Los Angeles, may look very different than an attorney's job if you're at a large law firm in New York City, and so it's really that kind of initial homework step is often missing. And that, I think, is a big part of, what generates the concerns about kind of the mismatch between whether the assessment is really valid and specific to the job.
Yeah,
I would really like.
I
just want to emphasize Matt's point, because the job analysis or the analysis of work is a step that's required but often skipped. And some people will tell you that the predictor criterion relationship, the test, the correlation between the test and the criterion measure is indicative of job relevance, that it wouldn't correlate if it were not job relevant. However, if you ever don't have anything to do, type in spurious correlations into Google and see what comes up. There are all kinds of things that are related to each other. There is a statistically significant correlation, but there is no relationship. So the amount of cheese produced in Wisconsin is related to the death rate in the state of Georgia. There is no reason for that. There is no rationale. It is something that is just a statistical anomaly. And it is really important to define what tasks are being performed and what knowledge, skills, and abilities are required to do those tasks, and then to develop tests that measure those skills. I prefer a direct assessment. I'm open to being convinced to an indirect assessment. I'll stop there. Excuse me, Marika.
One more quick point on that. Even if there's a real relationship, even if there's a real organic correlation, that correlation might not be based on the ability to perform the job. It might be based on irrelevant characteristics like your race, like your gender, like your background, that might measure cultural characteristics or commonalities that have existed in your company or your job in the past. An example that I heard from my former boss at Littler, the management side firm I was at, that I never asked him if this was real life, but he said, let's say hypothetically, you are developing a test for software engineers and you're doing, or sorry, a resume screener for software engineers. And the AI system picks up on, as a predictor of success, an interest in Japanese manga. Well, that may well be a correlation that exists in the data because there are a lot of people who are software engineers who have an interest in manga. But that doesn't necessarily have anything to do, obviously, with how well you are, how good you are at coding, and how good you are performing at the job. That has to do with the cultural context in which a lot of software engineers live their lives. So even if there is a correlation, that again kind of underscores the need for that job analysis and that thinking about what the knowledge and skills are, which is a step that, again, you know, the reason that a lot of companies turn to AI-based assessments is that HR does not generate revenues for a company. It is a cost center. So anything that they can do to reduce the amount of time that recruiters spend, and ideally reduce the number of recruiters that they have, is something that the company just in the C-suite is often like, that's a bottom line. And when a private equity firm comes in and buys a company, I've had this experience with clients many times before. One of the first things they often do is downsize the HR department. And so that is the pressure. And so there's a pressure on companies to cut these corners with these assessments. And I think that that drives kind of a lot of the appeal of the automated assessments and the corner cutting that those tools kind of seem to promise.
So what's interesting is it sounds like there probably is already existing violations happening, which is interesting because I don't think there are a lot of enforcement actions out there. And I think because there's so much talk about developing new laws, I think it's really important to keep in mind, like, we need to ensure that we're preserving existing legal protections and that those are lifted up, that employers and developers are taking a look at and making sure that they're complying with those existing laws and regulations. But Matt, I'm going to come back to you and just also ask, because at the same time, right, I think there is a lot of discussion around, like, well, what more do we need to build on top of this to address these AI tools? So I'm curious to get your take on, what is being developed right now, and what your thoughts are on the policy development.
Yeah. So in my view, the number one thing that is needed in this space is transparency. I always say that transparency is the hill that I will die on. And with some technologies, transparency is not enough. When it comes to data privacy, for example, simply telling people that you're collecting their data is probably not enough to protect their rights, because we don't have a lot of underlying laws that protect consumers' privacy in the absence of laws governing data privacy. Anyway, that's a separate issue. But in the context of AI decisions, we actually do have laws in place that protect people from discrimination when an automated or any other kind of employment assessment results in them not getting a job. And the big thing that to me is missing is that with AI assessments, it's not always obvious to somebody that they are being assessed, much less how they are being assessed. When you apply for when you sit down and take a paper and pencil test or an online personality assessment, there's no mistaking the fact that you are being tested. You can see the questions, you have some sense of the nature of the assessment. If you've applied for a job, you've read the job description, and you might be able to kind of infer how it relates to the different elements of the job. But with AI, that transparency is often lacking. And, like, to use an extreme example, some companies use targeted job advertisements that only go to specific people, and those are the only people that find out about the job, and the AI is analyzing their social media profiles or other things to decide whether or not they might be a good fit. In this extreme example, the people who don't get that ad don't even know that the job exists. And then, like, there's another layer. You can think of resume screeners. Well, you submit your resume to a company. You don't know whether or not there's an AI system that is reviewing it. You know that a job exists now, but you have no idea that AI is involved in the assessment process. And then you have the sorts of things that Hilke was showing in her presentation, like AI video interviews. You may well be aware that you are doing a video interview and that a job exists, but you have no idea that there's an AI system behind the screens, behind the scene, assessing it and evaluating you for the job. Like, so there's all of these multiple levels of lack of transparency and obscurity that really prevent civil rights laws in particular from functioning effectively when it comes to AI-based assessments. And to me, that is the number one issue that needs to be addressed. And there are legislative proposals out there, including there's a whole spate of bills that have been introduced across the country in recent months that appears to be based on model legislation created by Workday, which is an HR tech company. And unfortunately, that legislation, as it was originally drafted, has like lots of loopholes. It would not provide meaningful transparency for the vast majority of tools that companies use. And to me, again, like as I say, that's the hill I die on. If you don't get that transparency, the rest almost doesn't matter. And there are other proposals out there. Colorado, actually, their legislature just passed this week. The governor hasn't signed it, and there's quite a bit of question about whether he will. Colorado just passed a bill that started off as a version of that model legislation from Workday, but that at the behest of consumer and labor groups, the transparency provisions were strengthened. Some of the loopholes were closed. And unfortunately, what we've seen, the Chamber of Progress posted this, what I thought was absolutely bizarrely misleading and overblown letter this morning encouraging the governor to veto it. And that's really like a dynamic that we're seeing in a lot of the policy space right now. Even these efforts to provide basic transparency are met with extreme pushback from tech companies that frankly just don't want to be regulated in any way, shape, or form.
Well, that makes a ton of sense that transparency would be the hill you die on, because I mean, we're just talking about how much great law already exists, but nothing's really being done because workers, consumers don't know that this technology is being used against them. So that makes a lot of sense. Do you know if they're doing anything in the EU on this?
So there was just this past winter. I get my timelines confused, but I believe it was in January, the EU AI Act went into effect. That is a very large and complicated law. But in short, what it does is it says that certain types of AI systems, including those that are used in hiring, are considered high risk, and they impose certain transparency and testing obligations. It's not even testing, but basically there's like governance and risk management obligations that are imposed on companies that use these tools to make sure that they comply with applicable laws. Notably, as it turned out, I think that the way that the EU AI Act was written is going to actually prove less meaningful in terms of protecting workers and consumers than the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, that's already been on the books for 6 years and that already required pretty strong disclosure of data processing, which includes most uses of people's data in order to make decisions about them for hiring. And it also included some, requirements relating to, opt-out rights and other things like that in connection with automated decisions. So Europe is several years ahead of us on, both data privacy and relatedly on automated decision making.
Okay, we have some really great questions. Thank you for the participants for putting these questions in there. Okay, I'm going to get to the Q&A. So what do you think the impact will be of the EEOC's recent amicus brief in a lawsuit filed by a job applicant against Workday that argues that the third-party software providers could be considered employment agencies? Anyone want to take that? I mean, it might just be we have to see.
I'm not a lawyer, but I think this is like an idea to say that, like, you know, these old laws that are 40 years old, or guidelines, could be applicable here, because we don't actually have anything that would put vendor, you know, that makes vendors liable. So this is, I think, sort of an attempt to possibly do that, but I don't know if that's actually going to come through. But I think there is like a clear impediment here to change the laws and the guidelines that we are under, because the problem is the job seekers I speak to, they think humans watch the hire view interviews. They don't understand that, like, in many cases, AI will judge them. And, you know, the same with resumes. They think people, you know, humans do this. And then vendors don't want to talk about when the technology doesn't work, because, you know, it's their technology. I get it. But even employers, I've talked to so many HR departments now who said, like, oh yeah, we used Pymetrics for 2 years, and then we had all these questions that you raised and it didn't work. And one lawyer also found gender discrimination. You know, it just wasn't, the women weren't getting through the tool at similar rates. And the company just dropped it quietly, because they're afraid of lawsuits of job applicants. So no one is none the wiser. And the EEOC can't do anything to push and change, you know, file lawsuits. I think that is sort of the crux here.
Great. I'm going to go actually to this last question in a second. So can anyone speak more about how firms are using algorithms to monitor, fire, and promote workers?
I can speak to that. I think Matt can probably also chime in. So we know that like 8 out of the 10 largest employers in the United States monitor their workers. And we know that large companies, many of them use a company aware that does sentiment analysis. So anything that happens on a work computer, any text you type in, anything you have in your Google Drive, any Slack messages can be analyzed, any Zoom messages can be analyzed for sentiment, what you say, and also for infractions, like, are you a bully? Are you compliant with the law? It can be sent to IT, to legal, to HR. Anything can be analyzed. And we see that companies also analyze sort of, you know, who should be promoted based on AI. They also have like flight risk calculations. You know, who's going to leave the company, and should we give them an incentive or not to stay here based on spurious correlations, I think. And, you know, they can also check anything that happens on a work computer. You put in a USB file, maybe you're moving files around. If you move files around, that can trigger a legal complaint. And I think what we also see, the firing, we see this starting up. So we see, you know, certain companies, especially in warehouses, have productivity algorithms. So if workers don't put, I don't know, 300 items in a box every hour and they fall underneath that at a certain amount of time, they will get fired. We also see that for like drivers, right? We have like GPS coordinates and can check how long does it take them to deliver a package. And if it's not satisfactory so and so many times, they might also get fired. And we know this from surveys of HR managers who were asked in 2023 if they have to do layoffs in 2024, would they take results from AI tools into consideration? And almost 50% said yes. And then they also said that they know that these tools are very problematic. That, for example, tools can check how many hours people sit at their desk. You know, like every keystroke you put in your computer, they can check, are you on your computer? Well, if you then start discriminating against people who have the highest absentee times because they're not, you know, they don't have their butt in their seat for those many hours, you know, you're probably going to hit people with disabilities and a lot of caregivers, mothers most often, because they have the highest rate of absentees. These are protected classes in the United States. So this gets very problematic very quickly. And we also see a lot of health algorithms coming into the workplace. And I think there's a lot of tension around that, around privacy that I see developing.
One other question was around the workers that engage in organizing or protected concerted activity. I mean, this is somewhat related, but I'm sure is there evidence, I'll say, is there evidence that, you know, these tools are also monitoring for that and taking action on that as well?
Very briefly, yes. And I also I could spend the entire remaining 25 minutes talking about what I refer to sometimes as bossware systems, which is what I refer to as the combination of electronic surveillance and automated management of workers. Rather than do that, I'm just going to drop into the chat for everyone a couple of resources that I and other organizations that we're affiliated with have put out on this topic. And I don't want to get on my soapbox for too long, so I'm going to leave that there. And anybody who wants to reach out and discuss this issue more, I'm happy to do so. There's definitely a lot of concerns on that front as well.
Yeah, I would just
sure.
add that in addition to determining whom to promote, some organizations are also scraping the data in their company databases, the performance management systems, the Slack messages, the email messages, et cetera, to determine who gets to be a high potential employee, who gets to go into a management development program. And again, this is a mushy area. A lot of people don't think that as a selection decision, but as soon as the management development program is the primary way of getting into a management job, it is a selection decision. It's an employment decision. And so that is an extension of the use of AI for promotions, and yet some organizations don't really recognize it.
Yeah. Another really good question for those 80 million Americans who have public arrest records, how is this tool impacting those workers? Have there been any studies or evidence on that?
So there's been
what can we do to fight
no
that?
studies that I know of, but we've known of surveys, and from surveys of HR managers, and one of the surveys was that about when companies use AI, about 50% of those 2,200 HR managers and CEOs and C-suite executives answered that if you have an unemployment of 6 months or longer, you get automatically rejected. I mean, that is people who are imprisoned, or people who are taking time to care for family members and have this break in employment that will reject them. So I don't know if we've seen any long-term studies. And I just want to say, I wish we could tell you that, human discrimination may be worse than AI discrimination or the other. We don't know that. We need long-term studies where companies hire people with traditional measures, with AI measures, thousands of people, look at them over years to understand, did the prediction actually come true and was it fair? And we have we don't know that. We don't have any research. I've never talked to a company that does this kind of work. I wish they would. I wish we could incentivize them. The same with somebody put in the University of Chicago study that looked at specific companies. And that was on, sort of looking at first names and other criteria that could be discriminatory. And so the problem is also, I know because sometimes I'm on companies' websites, on vendors, and I see which company they work with, but there's no central point where any company has to tell anyone what AI vendor they're working with. And a lot of times there's been, companies now feel kind of weird to tell the public that. So HireVue doesn't tell me or others anymore who they're working with. So we don't actually know which company uses what tool. If they use AI, we have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, in California, we actually have really robust protections around the consideration of a conviction history. And I do wonder, I mean, it's a good question because even though we have those protections, but an employer is using some tool where they don't necessarily fully understand what's being used to scrape and filter through candidates, there may be a violation there that they don't even know. So I think, again, this kind of goes back to the whole transparency piece. It's we probably have the laws actually to protect against this discrimination. It's just a matter of people really understanding whether or not they are being subject to unlawful discrimination. Hilka, it looks like you were going to answer Mitra's question that she posted here. It might be helpful to understand how something is required is so often skipped. Is this a problem of enforcement?
Oh yeah, I think this is to the job analysis. That we see all the, most AI tools like work on copying the workers that are already in place, right? Like that's how these tools are often calibrated. And the problem is that sort of often skips, and I've talked to some of the companies, so they do a pseudo job analysis afterwards. So they have the folks who are in the job play the games. They find out, okay, all of these are risk takers. And then they look at the job and be like, I think risk taking is really important in this way. Or they have like capabilities of capabilities of capabilities. I don't even know what the evidence possibly can be that, risk taking relates to this and to this and to this. So they string this narrative together, but there isn't actually, we don't see this very often where they look at like, okay, to be an accountant, these are the 3 skills that you need to have. How are we going to find them? It's like, no, we have this test that we want everyone to take that looks for these 10 capabilities. We don't even know if that works, but maybe it looks for risk-taking behavior, but that doesn't have anything to do with the job. No one looks for that. And I think that's sort of another problem. And I know that people think like, oh, we should have third-party auditing. If companies are required to pay outside auditors to audit their tools, then we will, this will help the industry. And I have a lot of problems with that. Like, first of all, we see this in New York City, that a lot of companies don't comply with the law that is started there. We've only have a fraction of employers who actually put out these audits, but the companies pay for it. It's a clear conflict of interest. We've seen this in like subprime mortgages where companies paid folks to rate their own products. They all rated them AAA, even though they were garbage. I think that might be happening here as well. And actually, like, one of the audits of one of the video game vendor, I was reporting on it, and while these computer science professors were doing the audit, they were telling me, oh, they actually found a problem. They found an intersectional bias for Black women versus men. And I have the draft of the paper, and when the paper came out, it wasn't in there anymore. So I asked the computer scientist, like, well, the company that we did this for, they said that, it wouldn't be legal to look at the intersectionality, only to look at gender, men versus women, and the different races against each other, but not actually looking at the intersectionality of like Black women versus white men, where we see a lot of these tools create problems. And I was just stunned. Like, I don't, and I talked to the EUC and others about it, and they were like, no, you can absolutely test for this. But this was like, this is like vendor driven. They pay for these audits. And I don't think that is a really good solution here.
Okay, we have 1 more minute. Matt, thanks for answering some of these questions. We'll end with, first of all, Hilke, you mentioned that you believe people are dropping out of the labor force due to AI barriers at the hiring process. Is there research on this? If there's a source or numbers, can you put it in the, okay, if not,
I wish I only know because I talk to people who have to send in 400, 500 applications, and they talk about how they drop out, and they, talk to their therapist, and they're very depressed, but I've never seen any numbers.
Is this in your book though? Do you talk about this?
Some of the job seekers, yeah.
Okay, so there's your source.
All anecdotal evidence. I want to be very clear. It's just job seekers. I found it. I talked.
And then I love this. I mean, what about a tool on the other side, right? Like, so I know I need a bookcase behind me. Are there other tools? Like, how do we know what the keywords are that we should be? Do you know if anything's being used to help workers in this context? No.
I mean, there is like sort of a niche market of folks on YouTube who say like, hey, you have to do this to pass this test. But the problem is like, so here's another crux about these technologies that we see that we can't often even train for these one-way video interviews, because the companies themselves do not know what the tool infers upon. So what happens is like you put the data into an AI tool and you know the results, but you don't actually know what actually happened. So the problem is here that we saw with African American and all of these keywords. It's like when somebody comes in, an employment lawyer later, and demands that the vendor opens up the black box and asks them like, what exactly did you infer on? We can ask these computers. But the problem is that the vendors often don't do this. And when I talk to HireVue and others, they tell me like, oh, it's 10,000 data points, 50,000 data points, 80,000 data points. And I'm like, what is it? And what are you exactly looking at? We're like, we don't know. It's a deep neural network. No one knows. And I think that strikes me as another complication. No one knows why somebody was rejected or put into the yes pile.
Yeah. All right, we are at 101. I just want to thank all of our fantastic panelists. Again, this was so interesting. Thank you for all the attendees for coming and listening in. I hope this was as enlightening as for all of you as it was for me. If there are any questions, I think definitely reach back out to our hosts. We'd be happy to follow up. And so much more to talk about this, so much more developments that I'm sure we'll all be watching in the next months and years. So thank you again, everyone. Appreciate your time. Take care. Bye.